Morning. Will you show love to the band? That was beautiful. I joked with them early this morning when they were practicing that they should cut a CD, and I was reminded CDs aren't a thing anymore. Well, this morning we continue on in our sermon series on the Beatitudes. We're spending the course of this year focusing on the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the three chapters of Matthew, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, that these are really the kind of quintessential teachings of Jesus, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means to live and embody the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And so we began in January by just kind of going beatitude by beatitude, really honing in and focusing on what these words mean, not only for the original audience that would have heard these teachings of Jesus, but certainly for us as well. And so I want you today, as we look at another beatitude, to really place yourself in the shoes as much as we can as Western Christians, 2,000 plus years removed from this time of history and certainly removed from this culture, a Mediterranean, Palestinian type of culture. But to try to put yourself in the shoes of the original hearers, that the group that gathered around Jesus were a band of misfits and outcasts. These were spiritual nobodies. These were people who had no credentials to their name. They weren't the Pharisees, although the Pharisees would have been listening to Jesus. They weren't the righteous. They were common, everyday people that constantly were overlooked by Rome, by the religious officials. These were people of deep poverty, both physically, materially, as well as spiritually. And to hear these words that we've said that the word blessing that we hear in the Beatitudes, that it probably is better understood as God's favor rests upon. Not that it's some kind of material blessing or even happiness as we might understand happiness today, but really it's about God and the God who pours favor upon the people who are overlooked. So listen to these words again. You're invited to turn to Matthew 5 if you want, or just sit and listen to the Beatitudes again. God's favor is upon the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. God's favor is on those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God's favor is on the meek, for they will inherit the earth. God's favor are on those who hunger and thirst for righteousness or justice, for they will be filled. God's favor is on the merciful, for they will receive mercy. God's favor is on the pure in heart, for they will see God. God's favor is on the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. God's favor is on those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. God's favor is on you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Friends, this is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Blessed, or God's favor, is on the pure of heart, for they will see God. Now, I need to be really honest with you. I have struggled with this, not only this sermon, but this word pure. And it's my own spiritual baggage. It's my own, spiritual trauma, having grown up in a particular faith community that loved the word purity. Loved this word, and purity is a loaded word. If you were raised in a church or a tradition like mine, whether it was an evangelical tradition or perhaps a very conservative church, you probably heard purity connected to certain things. Perhaps it was around sex, or the clothes you should wear or not wear, or gender roles and expectations, or conversations about who you can love and who you can't love. It was what's called this purity culture. And so perhaps you were told to abstain from any sexual relationship before marriage, or you signed a purity pledge or wore a purity ring. And many young girls have been told, perhaps you were told, that you should dress modestly in order not to tempt the boys and their lustful thoughts. All the while being frustrated that young boys are rarely told to respect women's bodies and autonomy. The pressure is on young girls. And many of these kind of culture world wars that we often see playing out in our current political climate, they have deep roots in this damaging purity culture movement. And so perhaps you've been wounded by this shame associated with purity, and fearful that if you mess up or when you messed up, that somehow you then would become a disappointment to your parents, to your peers, or even a disappointment to God. Now, it's important to note that this is not what Jesus meant when he talked about purity. Even in Jesus' day, there was a lot of confusion about what purity meant. Perhaps in the backdrop of Jesus saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Perhaps in the backdrop of the minds of those who have gathered was Psalm 23 that says, "Who shall ascend up the hill to the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place?" Or another way of saying that is, who will actually see God? Who has the privilege of seeing God? And the psalmist says, those who have clean hands and a pure heart. And that idea of clean hands, that's what was drilled down into the crowd repeatedly. Clean hands or strict religious observance, that's what led to a clean and pure heart. That one's worth to God was measured by their adherence to the rules of the religious law. Or your external actions, what you do or what you don't do, are what earn God's favor and then in turn gives you access to God. This is what the Pharisees preached over and over and over to the crowd, and over the crowd could never measure up. But Jesus in the Beatitude says nothing about an external clean hands. In fact, his ministry would fly in the face of these religious rules and expectations and regulations. I mean, Jesus, he would be the one that would touch lepers, making himself ceremonially unclean, no longer having clean hands. It was Jesus who was touched by a woman who was hemorrhaging. It was Jesus who would touch the dead. It was Jesus who would get in trouble by the Pharisees because he wouldn't wash his hands before a meal, which is not sanitary. If purity, as Jesus says it, was about religious observance, then Jesus' own hands were very, very dirty. If purity meant some sort of moral perfection, then no one in the crowd would qualify. I mean, Jesus had said these words, God's favor rests upon those who are poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who mourn, all these different kind of categories of people. And now Jesus would say that God's favor rests upon those who are pure in some sort of religious ceremonial sense. He would have excluded the entire crowd. I mean, think about how often the writers of the Gospels cue us in to Jesus' fan base. It was the sinners, the tax collectors, prostitutes, spiritually bankrupt people, those who had little access to religious ceremonies and practices. If Jesus understood purity in the narrowest sense of moral perfection, then this message to the crowd would be far from good news. Jesus would have been no better than the Pharisees, who constantly preached a message of some sort of moral superiority. But what we see repeated in Jesus' teachings in his ministry is not ritual cleanliness, but rather a shifting conversation from these external compliances to rules and regulations to something far more internal, an internal transformation of the heart. So then if Jesus isn't talking about some external religious practice, what does he mean when he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart"? Well, the word that's recorded for us in Greek is katharos, which does mean clean or unmixed or undiluted, but it also means, and the way I think Jesus is using this word, is to be refined. Much like you would take metal and melt it to refine it. And so when Jesus speaks of purity, I don't think he's talking about washing our hands in some external way to adhere to some religious practices. What I think he's talking about is an invitation to become integrated as people in our inner life. The heart itself in Jewish thought was the center of a person's being. It's where their will and their desire resided. It's where emotions were understood to reside. It's where people had their sense of identity and purpose. It's where they was believed the soul was. More than the mind, the heart was understood as the place of motivations and decision making. It's why Proverbs 4 would say, "Keep and protect your heart with vigilance, because from it flows the springs of life." It was the center of a person's being. So what does Jesus mean about purity of a center of someone's being? I think Jesus is alluding to what the psalmist would also say in Psalm 86. "Give me an undivided heart." Purity is not sinlessness or moral superiority or perfection. It's about single-heartedness. It's when our inner world really matches our outer world. We've used this analogy before. Think of like an iceberg. Now, I've never really seen an iceberg in real life, but think of like in the movie Titanic. That's my closest connection to an iceberg. The bulk of an iceberg isn't what you see on the surface. The mass of an iceberg is what's underneath the surface. What you see is a small percentage above the water. Purity of heart comes when what's underneath the external becomes aligned and rooted in the love of God. It's when our public self really matches our private self, that there's integration and wholeness. A pure of heart is a heart that's not distracted. It's not pulled in 10 directions. It's centered and grounded and rooted. And we live in a world that we are constantly having to divide ourselves. We're taught that vulnerability is weakness, so we mask up, protecting what's really going on in our inner world. We curate images that people can see. We manage their impressions of us. We create narratives about our own lives, sometimes as a defense mechanism to be protected from being fully seen. Simon Walker, one of my favorite books, a leadership book called The Undefended Leader, uses a concept from a psychologist, Irving Goffman, who talks about front stage, backstage, using actor language. And that there's a curtain, if you've ever been in theater, there's a curtain that divides, what's going on backstage you don't see. And Goffman talks about all of us play a role up front. But much of our identity, our insecurities, our unresolved pain and trauma, that's what exists backstage. And you and I spend an inordinate amount of time seeking to keep the curtain closed, lest anyone see what's really going on backstage, or if what's backstage accidentally leaks into what's on the front of the stage. And if we're honest, we often don't even know what's tucked away back there in the recesses of behind the curtain. I think when Jesus is inviting us to purity of heart, he's inviting us into a life of wholeness, of integration, of being centered and rooted in our own hearts. Serene Jones, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary, I love how she describes salvation. She says, we make salvation about so many things. Primarily as Protestants, we make it about going to heaven. When I die, I'll go to heaven. Jones says salvation really is about taking the fragmented parts of ourself and experiencing the healing work of grace. And she says it's really about God re-narrating our fractured identities. Purity is not scrubbing ourselves clean. It's allowing God to plumb the depths of our heart, to discover the parts that have been exiled or ignored, the places where there's pain and woundedness, the places where we have protected out of fear, and to allow God to start telling a truer story about who we actually are. And Jesus says when we experience this purity of our heart, then we will see God. Which feels odd to say because no one has seen God. And in fact, Exodus 33 would remind us that no one can see and behold the holiness of God. And yet Jesus says those who have purity in the center of their being, the reward is they will see God. That word see is not like a physical seeing. It's far more close and intimate than that. It's about experiencing communion with God. How can we experience communion with God if we hide parts of ourselves from God? Much like in the garden story of Adam and Eve, when shame creeps in, what's their first response? To hide themselves, to hide their vulnerability, to cover their nakedness. And in doing so, now all of a sudden there's a disconnect between them and God. Teresa of Avila, the 14th century Carmelite nun and mystic, Spanish mystic, she had many visions of God, and she recorded those visions, and she wrote a book called The Way of Perfection. And in that book, The Way of Perfection, she spends a lot of time talking about perfection or purity, has nothing to do with kind of moral accomplishments. And she says the way of perfection is to invite in your heart, the core of who you are, Christ. To picture Christ with you and to listen to where Christ might be doing a little bit of decluttering in your heart. and to discern what gets in the way of fully being known by God and fully being known by others. It's an invitation to intimacy with Christ. And she says that when we do that, when we invite Christ to do that inner work in us, then what happens is our heart starts to align and center itself in Christ's heart. And then, she says, we begin to mirror Christ and reflect Christ and become more like Christ. So purity is not achieved by trying harder. It's an invitation, a daily invitation to allow God to mend our divided heart, to reorient our life toward God, and to bring healing and wholeness and restoration to places in our life. It's a work of grace. Ezekiel says it this way, Ezekiel 36, I will give you a new heart. And for a long time in my life, I believed what Ezekiel was saying was almost like a transplant. If you're having a heart transplant, a surgeon takes your heart, pops it out of your chest, and takes a new heart and pops it into. That's how I've always understood this passage. But I'm rethinking it. I don't think that what Ezekiel is saying or the journey that Christ is inviting us into is about taking our heart and completely throwing it away and putting something entirely new. I think it's an invitation for Christ to work on the heart that we have, to work within us, to bring healing and wholeness to our core self. Because if the heart in Jewish thought is understood as the place of the soul, the place of the will, the place of desire, the place of the core of who we are, why would God take that and replace it with something that isn't us? Instead, I think the invitation of a pure heart is not for something entirely new. It's to become new, but to invite Christ into those sacred spaces of our lives, the places that we have hid from others, and say, do a new work there. This is why that language of refining, I think, is what Jesus is getting at when he talks of purity. Gold is refined by heat. It's not about judgment. It's about experiencing the purifying love of Jesus. But what it requires of us is surrender. To surrender all parts of our being to the care of God, surrendering our need to be seen a certain way, letting go of our obsession for impression management, and allowing first and foremost God to see us as we truly are. And for us to see ourselves as we truly are. And eventually to allow others to see us as we truly are. In the words of the great spiritual formation writer Dallas Willard, it's a renovation of our heart. It's inviting God to heal and fill and reshape the deepest parts of our human nature, our desires, our motivations, our habits, and to make us into the image of Jesus. It's to engage with grace, not as a theological concept, but allowing God's love to penetrate the very depths of our souls. It's not about behavior modification, but it's about getting our external world in line with our internal world. And hear me, this is not easy. It is a lifelong journey. And we fail more often than we succeed. But if it is true what 2 Peter says, that we are to be partakers of the divine nature, that must require a total renovation of our hearts. And so I want us to practice this today. And I'm going to make some of you really uncomfortable. And that's good. That's why you pay me. We're going to do a spiritual practice together. I'm going to guide us through this meditation. This has been a practice of mine that has been deeply meaningful and painful and at times very scary. But I'm finding in my life that this is how I understand communion with God. Even beyond all the good spiritual disciplines that we participate in, prayer, scripture reading, communion, all those things. This is how I find in my life I am the closest to God. And it's an invitation for God to continue to plumb the depths of our soul. And so I'm going to guide us. And so again, if you're uncomfortable, just sit there in uncomfort. But I want to invite you to kind of put your feet flat on the ground. If you want to put your hands on your lap, or I often put my hands over my heart. And I'm just going to guide us through this so that it might be something you practice and try in your own life. This is not magic. This is not rocket science. It's invitation. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and just begin to breathe. Take slow breaths. For those of you who are achievers like me, you don't have to achieve anything right now. You're not here to impress God. You're just here to be present with God. So I invite you to just take 3 slow, deep breaths, and as you do, maybe recite a breath prayer, like as you breathe in your heart, in your mind, or you can say it out loud of, "Here I am, Lord," and breathe out. 3 big, deep breaths. And exhale. A deep breath in. And exhale. One more deep breath in. And exhale. Hear these words: "Give me an undivided heart." So as you sit, where do you feel that your heart is being pulled in multiple directions? What desires compete with your love for God? What part of your life have you kept closed and hidden? So keep breathing slowly and deeply. I invite you to imagine that your heart is like a house with many rooms. As you walk around the house of your heart, notice, are there any rooms that are locked? Are there any rooms that as you pass by, you feel something? Maybe it's fear or insecurity, questions. Perhaps if you enter a room, is it cluttered? Maybe it's full of cobwebs and sheets covering dusty furniture. It's been a while since you visited that room. Is there a room that's full of noise There's no fixing these rooms. It's just noticing them. And noticing what you feel as you walk beside them, as you peer in them, or as you walk into them. As you stand before or next to or in one room, hear these words: "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." I invite you to picture Jesus standing at the door of your heart, or standing at the door of the room that you felt something when you walked beside it or touched the door. Notice Jesus isn't forcing entry. He's not shaming you. He's knocking as an invitation. And as you picture Jesus, as you see him in your own heart, notice the expression on his face. Perhaps look into his eyes, feel the physicality of his presence in front of you. What do you feel as he knocks? What makes you hesitant to open the door? And if you're ready, I invite you to imagine opening the door to allowing Jesus to see the thing that has laid hidden for so long. So hear this prayer. Lord, I open to you the parts of me I prefer to hide. I open to you my divided desires. I open to you my ambition, my fear, my need for control. Cleanse what is cluttered. Unify what is scattered. Give me an undivided heart. I invite you to sit with Christ in that room. Pay attention to what feels heavy or sad or disheveled or needing care. And continue to invite Christ into that space. If shame creeps in over what you see or feel, seek to let it go like ashes that blow away in the wind. There's no judgment in this space with Jesus. It's just pure love. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Purity is not scrubbing these rooms clean. It's surrender. It's allowing God to love you without resistance. So thank Jesus for being with you in this room. And if you're ready, give Jesus permission to return to this room time and time again, and to start the journey of healing. I invite you to slowly return to yourself, to the space around you. Feel the pew around you, the bodies next to you. Invite you to open your eyes. I would invite you to find time today, if that was meaningful for you, to journal what you felt or what you saw, to name what came up for you, what surprised you, what scared you, where you felt pain, sadness, release, joy, healing. Maybe again this week sometime, if you have 5-10 minutes in your schedule, to invite Jesus to return to that room with you. Maybe it's before you go to bed, when you wake up in the morning, on your lunch break. And don't feel rushed. The journey of purifying our hearts is a lifelong journey. There's no rushing this. There's no crossing the finish line. And I want to encourage you too, if there was a part of you that you felt like, oh, I've locked something in that room and I'm scared of what's there, to speak to a therapist or to a spiritual director. Pastor Todd and I would love to sit with you and hear what perhaps you felt or saw or experienced. And so as we close our worship, I leave you with this blessing. May the God who searches hearts make yours whole. May what is divided become unified. May what is cluttered become clear. And may you see God, not someday only, but in the here and the now. God bless you. Go in peace.